Every hero is measured by how they move beyond tragedy. But under writer Gerry Conway, Spider-Man's greatest tragedy redefined a hero's world forever. After co-creating Spider-Man in 1962 with Steve Ditko, Stan Lee went on to author the first 100 issues of The Amazing Spider-Man. But at the start of the 70s, Stan's time as the man behind Spider-Man had come to a close. And while Marvel editor-in-chief Roy Thomas had briefly taken the reins for an arc, the time had come for a new long-term writer on The Amazing Spider-Man. The question was, who could possibly replace him? Enter 19-year-old Gerry Conway, the young prodigy whose first published comic came at the age of 16. When Stan officially stepped down as author, and generally stopped writing comics altogether as part of his move to the role of publisher at Marvel, Conway was brought on board The Amazing Spider-Man with issue 111 in August of 1972. It was the start of a 39-issue, 3-year run that saw him and a small stable of artists put Peter Parker through some of his darkest, most formative moments. Gerry Conway's run on The Amazing Spider-Man from issue 111 through 149 is a time of growth for both the title and the character. The story of a Spider-Man experiencing irreparable losses and new life-changing loves, creating a permanent shift into a more mature young man who's more aware than ever of just how cruel the world can be, but who will never give up the fight. Here, we'll look at the storytelling techniques of Conway and his 3 major artistic collaborators, the origins and reverberations of the greatest tragedy to ever happen in the world of Spider-Man, and the evolving nature of Peter Parker and his many different relationships over the course of Conway's run. Together, these elements mark the beginning of a new age for Spider-Man. Oh no, it can't be happening. It can't be. Doc Ock is marrying Aunt May. Conway's time on Spider-Man started off in a somewhat unconventional manner, coming on board to finish a 3-part story started by Lee, locked in battle with the dangerous Kraven the Hunter and the not-so-memorable Gibbon. Afterward, Conway quickly rolled into a 4-part story that saw both Spider-Man and his extremely fragile and increasingly senile Aunt May embroiled in a gang war between Dr. Octopus and the newly introduced Hammerhead. And besides a color reprint of Spectacular Spider-Man Magazine #1 by Lee and John Romita, which ran from issues 116 through 119 with additional material written by Conway to fit current continuity, and one more issue after, it was the last of Conway's work with the legendary artist. Romita's work with Conway was brief, but his artistic imprint on Spider-Man lasted throughout Conway's run and influenced the hero's look for decades. Romita took the meek and scrawny Ditko approach to Peter and pushed him into a bulkier, more heroic, more handsome interpretation that would permanently stick. Conway would cite the experienced Romita as his guide, and once Romita left, artist Gil Kane came on board for 5 issues, including Conway's biggest story. Kane really loved a tight close-up on a character for extra drama, isolating faces in the frame, and frequently using a multiple floating heads thought collage to give weight behind internal monologues and moments of realization. It was his love of breaking down critical moments of action into multiple consecutive frames that highlighted an almost unthinkable tragedy. But the majority of Conway's run was drawn by Ross Andru. Andru isn't as big of a name as either Romita or Kane, but his work is just as dynamic, bold, and classically formative. Andru often punctuates his pages with characters breaking free from panels, and frequently drew Spider-Man multiple times in a single image to emphasize his speed and movement. Andru's stories also kept up a rapid pace, with Conway filling in gaps with caption boxes to keep the reader up to speed. When Marvel cut back on the total pages per issue to save money in the back half of Conway's run, that shorthand became an absolute necessity, and also caused some later stories to lose their resonance. Andru was also wholeheartedly committed to recreating Manhattan as it truly was, going to the real-life locations of an upcoming story and taking photos for reference. Andru's focus on detailed recreation, combined with colorist David Hunt's bright, simple primary colors, and a host of inkers working in classic, clean, thick lines, make this Marvel world into a more heightened version of the actual New York of the 70s, a world that informed the types of stories Conway wanted to tell. Stan had wanted to introduce comics to the real world, Conway said. My feeling at that time, being a kid living in New York, was that things were very dangerous and the world was kinda dark. We were in the middle of the Vietnam War. We had a president who was about to resign. My notion at that time was that even with the best intentions, even with the greatest sense of responsibility, even with the greatest power, a hero does not necessarily succeed. And in fact, sometimes the very attempt to do so can be destructive. Conway's run is almost entirely made up of 2-issue arcs, setting up stories for more room to explore Peter's complicated personal life and stage bigger fights. He also consistently uses several hallmark storytelling devices. First, Conway is constantly throwing a physical ailment onto Parker to keep him off balance, underpowered and under more pressure. Early on, Peter develops a stomach ulcer from constant stress, gets sick frequently, suffers radiation poisoning, often runs out of web fluid, and severely injures both of his hands, among many other multi-issue physical setbacks. Conway also introduces quite a few new villains, some that would become mainstays of Spider-Man comics, and some that were the Mindworm. Many of these new characters would have ties to then-current political issues, like Tarantula's background as a soldier for a South American fascist government. And of course there's the debut of the Punisher, whose lethal anti-heroism initially made him more of a morally gray gunslinger than an outright homicidal vigilante. When classic villains do return, Conway ups their powers to challenge his hero, but he rarely gives Spider-Man a massive external physical obstacle to overcome. Combine stronger villains with physical ailments and Peter's often spiraling mental state, and the greatest challenges in Conway's Spider-Man become internal rather than external. A more complex internal life is also given to Peter's supporting cast, who are brought into the main narrative of nearly every issue. Their frequent inclusion here means that Conway builds them up into multi-dimensional characters, with MJ, J. Jonah Jameson, and Flash Thompson benefiting most. Conway's dialogue is big, melodramatic, and strewn with 70s slang. These are high-stakes adventures where the emotional and thematic subtext becomes pure text. Conway's Spider-Man is a run where the emotions run higher than ever, and Peter needs to either grow as a person or be completely overwhelmed by his dangerous superhero life and soap opera personal life. And those two collide in one fateful moment. Hey kid, what's wrong? Don't you understand? I saved you. You can't be. In June 1973, Spider-Man and Marvel Comics changed forever with The Amazing Spider-Man number 121, the night Gwen Stacy died. While it's nothing new to state the importance of the death of Gwen Stacy within the history of comics, Gwen's tragic death really is the moment that Conway's entire run revolves around. John Romita wanted to kill off a major character to create some interest, Conway said. John's first thought was, let's kill off Aunt May. And my reaction to that was, Aunt May's been dying for 10 years and her dying would probably not be that much of a surprise. With May out of the question, Conway and Roy Thomas decided it would be Gwen Stacy, longtime girlfriend of Peter Parker. Conway had never been a fan of the character and thought that Mary Jane Watson would make a much better romantic partner for the hero. Placing another tragedy on the shoulders of Peter, who had grown into a much more confident and successful man over the course of Lee's 106 issues, would bring him back to the burden he had felt after the murder of Uncle Ben. But instead of the guilt that drove him to be a hero, Peter would now cope with guilt caused by his heroism. The comic that followed was one of the most shocking issues ever published at the time, and while the cover proclaims tragedy, everything inside points to the contrary, with Peter fighting off the Goblin and doing everything he can to save the kidnapped and unconscious Gwen. It's those final few pages that upend everything, driving the point home with the final splash page and the reveal of the comic's title. You're the creep who's going to pay! You killed the woman I love, and for that, you're going to die! The blunt, irreversible nature of Gwen's death, punctuated with a snap added by Conway, simply wasn't done in superhero comics at the time. Gwen may be scarcely featured in Conway's stories beforehand, but this is a shocking, brutal moment that doesn't pull any punches. Just as crucial is issue 122, which barrels forward with non-stop intensity, tragedy, and anger. We feel all of Pete's emotions, and his reflection on his relationship with Gwen is one of the best moments in Conway's entire run. These panels add the emotional gravitas that such a tragedy needed, convincing readers that their hero would nearly murder the goblin, pulling himself back from the edge at the last instant. This is all the shock and tragedy of the night Gwen Stacy died, given weight and meaning, then turned into a climactic fight that leads to the death of the goblin, but without any catharsis. At the end, Gwen's death remains a tragedy. Deciding to kill a long-lasting love interest was no small decision, and while Stan Lee was off the book, Conway, Romita, and Thomas asked for the creator's blessing before moving forward. But the shock and anger of audiences that came afterward led Lee to deny he approved the death. Stan was okay with it to the extent that Stan paid attention to anything, said Conway. Once he stopped writing a given comic, he stopped thinking about it. And so when he stopped writing Spider-Man, even though he had a proprietary interest in it, really it was, yeah, whatever you want to do. Stan didn't think about it until he went to a college campus and got yelled at by fans. Instead of acting like he was in charge, he said, "Oh, they must have done it while I was out of town. I would never have done that." He basically threw me to the wolves. The idea that the three of us together, or even separately, would have tried to sneak in the death of Gwen Stacy without Stan approving it is just so absurd, said Roy Thomas. Besides, he was never out of town that long. While the fallout of Gwen's death raged on in real life, it also reverberated within the comic. Spider-Man is wanted for the murder of Norman Osborn, whose goblin costume is removed by his son Harry before his body is found. And at the end of issue 122, Mary Jane chooses to stay and comfort a grieving Peter. A major turning point for her character, punctuated by the definitive closing of a door. Mary Jane and Peter Parker were drawn closer by tragedy, and the party girl MJ was soon revealed to have a complex inner life. Their romance seemed inevitable. Meanwhile, Stan demanded that Conway and company bring Gwen Stacy back to life. Take a long look at the Spider-Mobile. Now that's what I call a fiasco. There are a few significant moments throughout Conway's run that are the direct result of the creative team being pushed into and reacting against editorial mandates. The strangest of these is the debut of the Spider-Mobile. Spider-Man with a car? It's one of the most ridiculous decisions in the character's publication history. But did you know it was mandated by Stan Lee? Toy company Azrak Hamway offered Marvel a licensing deal to create a car for Spider-Man, and in response, Lee decreed that the new vehicle had to be in the comics. Conway, of course, thought it was ludicrous, and in a bit of meta-commentary, had a sleazy pair of businessmen offer to pay the wall crawler if he would create a Spider-Mobile. You don't have to look too closely to see their resemblance to Lee and Thomas, with their business card even having the same address as Marvel headquarters. The second major story to come from editorial mandate was the original Clone Saga. A direct result of Lee's demand for Gwen to return turned into a cementing of Conway's vision for MJ and Peter. After the tragedy, Gwen's death is constantly at the forefront of Peter's mind. No matter the story, the hero usually starts each issue deeply depressed, only to be roused out of it through a fight with the villain of the month. The cycle repeats, even if the comic is part 2 of a story, automatically resetting Peter to his previous emotional state and creating a sort of manic-depressive approach to Spider-Man. Conway also has events re-trigger his trauma. While it may only be a few months within comic time, Gwen's death haunts Peter for years in real-world time. Alongside his emotional recovery, Conway introduces the Jackal as the recurring villain pulling the strings, and breaks Harry Osborn's mind due to the combination of a bad acid trip and witnessing his father's death. The result is that Harry goes from being a crappy friend, seriously, this guy sucks, to becoming the Green Goblin, debuting in the only double-page spread of Conway's entire run to emphasize this horrifying development. If Gwen's death is the critical dramatic force behind Conway's run on ASM, then it's the romance of Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson that is its most important destination. Peter and MJ grow closer due to Harry's villainous change, and move from being good friends to romantic interests, with Peter not quite ready to move forward and MJ slowly warming to the idea of a committed relationship. Their first kiss in issue 143 is a lovely romantic moment, and something that Conway's entire statement on Spider-Man has been leading to. Andrew dedicates 2 quiet pages following their kiss to help it resonate, and the meaning is simple. Nothing will be the same after this. So about Stan wanting Gwen to come back. She did, as a clone. And so began the original Clone Saga. The Jackal, revealed to be college professor Miles Warren, clones Gwen and Peter, leading to a battle of Spider-Men. And while this climactic storyline would lead to the infamous Clone Saga of the 90s, it serves two purposes here, both of which affirm Conway's vision for Spider-Man. Bringing back Gwen provides the character with some closure and a chance at a new life, but it also affirms that Peter and Gwen can never be together again. It also affirms Peter's love of MJ, as it's his feelings for her that become Conway's final statement on the book. Conway's decision to leave The Amazing Spider-Man was sudden and spurred on by continued tensions behind the scenes. The author believed that he was next in line for the editor-in-chief position, but when Roy Thomas left and he didn't get the job, Conway returned to DC Comics and Superman, leaving dangling threads to be picked up by Archie Goodwin, while Andrew continued on the title for another 3 years. But Conway's stardom at both publishers would briefly bring him back to the webhead in 1976, writing Superman vs. The Amazing Spider-Man with Andrew, the first modern superhero crossover between the two rival companies, and one of the biggest comics of its day. Conway's Amazing Spider-Man stories are filled with just as much comedy as they are tragedy, some still potent, some distinctly of their time, but a sense of vibrant immediacy remains at the forefront. A hero whose almost manic commitment to saving the city is weighed down by a depression made heavier by the worst of tragedies. And it all takes place in a New York that springs from the mind of a young boy reader turned young author. It's a world that's just a little darker, whose villains feel just a little more dangerous, whose hero feels just a little closer to falling apart. But it's a comic that still captivates and thrills in all the ways great superhero stories should. From terrible loss to new love, Conway's Spider-Man sets the course for decades to follow. And in the aftermath of tragedy, love blossoms to guide the way for Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. A love that we ourselves would soon fall in love with. Mary Jane, lady, am I ever glad to see you. Do you mean that, Tiger? For real? Come here, and I'll show you. Hi everyone, just wanted to say thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. A video on the death of Gwen Stacy and Gerry Conway's entire career on Spider-Man has been a long time coming. I know that it's been frequently requested, and I hope that this different kind of approach was exciting and a little bit outside of the norm. It was really great to dig into this entire informative run and just kind of analyze everything that was going on at this time in Spider-Man. And it was really interesting to see how someone pick up from Stan Lee in such a definitive time on the character and also make stories that were just as crucial to Spider-Man as Lee was. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed watching. I will be back soon with another video, and I hope that providing this sort of entertainment is helpful in a time that's really difficult for some and very strange right now, and I hope that you all stay safe and watch out for others. Just take care of each other.